Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs War Room Update. We are on day number 320 of the war with Gaza, 319 with the war with Lebanon, and 300 and something with the war with the Houthis. The war with the terrorists in Judea and Samaria is ever ongoing. And in the background, constantly, the war with Iran, constantly featuring in every different aspect of the war room and in every different aspect of the terrorist attacks. Iran having spent billions of dollars to create this ring of fire around Israel. It was launched on the 7th of October and has just intensified ever since. On the war, on the ground, Israel is winning. Let there be no mistakes about it. In Gaza, our forces have managed to destroy over 17,000 terrorists, killing 17,000 terrorists, and incapacitating thousands of others. And every single day, the forces move forward just a little bit more. Really, the dramatic incidents of the last few days were the discovery and returning of 6 of the hostages that have been held by the Hamas terrorists since the 7th of October. 6 hostages will still remain, with 109 hostages being held in Gaza. And really what we're hearing today in the press, really over the world, are the failure of the talks with the genocidal terrorists, as much as you can hold talks with genocidal terrorists, in order to bring about the release of the other remaining hostages. That is, of course, one of the fundamental goals of the operations in Gaza. And as we move forward every day, we get closer and closer to freeing more and more of the hostages. And that is something which we've seen both with Mivtza Arnon that we saw a few months ago, releasing 4 live hostages. And again, and this time, unfortunately, bringing back the bodies of 6 hostages. But we know that there are many live hostages still being held by the terrorists. And as well as the bodies, Israel is doing everything really possible in order to bring about their release. Their forces are operating, as we've mentioned often, on the Philadelphia corridor, that area that is adjacent to the border with Egypt, discovering and exploding, according to the latest IDF report, over 180 different tunnels and tunnel shafts, some that crossed over into Gaza, some as big as allowing for the movement of trucks between Egypt and Gaza. This is a fundamental strategic asset of Israel, having blocked off that source of oxygen, both of goods, services, but predominantly money and weapons to the Hamas terrorists. In the north, the story is quite severe, unfortunately. This morning we had a barrage of over 50 rockets being fired at the Golan, hitting a few houses in Katsrin, in response to a massive IDF strike just last night in Lebanon, and pictures that were really spread around the internet quite widely of the attack being carried out, and then the scenes of the secondary explosions, missiles, rockets firing in all directions, as if it were a fireworks event to celebrate the 4th of July. But no, it wasn't. It was a strategic Hezbollah site attacked by IDF forces. Just today, the elimination of a senior Hamas operative, Khalil el-Makdach, as he was traveling along in Sidon. These are all parts of this continuing war of attrition with the Hezbollah terrorists. And whilst they are attacking us, whilst they have fired over 7,700 rockets at Israel, and today they specifically targeted civilian targets, let there be no doubts there as well. Hezbollah has suffered tremendous losses, including their chief of staff, Fuad Shukar, and Israel is continuing to attack Hezbollah's strategic assets all through the area. In the south, the Houthis, also acting on the behest of the Iranians, are continuing to interfere and interrupt the freedom of navigation through Bab el-Mandeb, through the Straits of Aden, and up towards the Red Sea. In Judea and Samaria, we've seen just this morning, a number of shooting attacks by the terrorists. Let's not forget that in Judea and Samaria, it's the same terrorists who are operating in Gaza, Hamas, the PFLP, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades that belongs to Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas's movement. They are all trying their best to carry out as many attacks as possible to take the lives of as many people as possible. Just 2 days ago, we saw an attempted suicide attack, or what appeared to be a suicide attack in Tel Aviv being averted. That first suicide attack since 2006. We're seeing the terrorists going back to their regular forms of activity. And yet, whilst Israel is managing really to carry out miracles in Gaza, in Lebanon, attacking the oil refineries 2,000 kilometers away in Yemen of the Houthis, and really persuading Iran that the balance of power, that the deterrence of Israel against responding for what they claim was an Israeli assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in the heartland of the IRGC in Tehran, whilst we are succeeding tremendously, we seem to be failing on the war of perception, getting Israel's message out to the wider international community. How could it be that you have a genocidal terrorist organization that is allowed to act freely and even enjoy the support of the international community? Shamefully, really shamefully. Today in the UN, they're marking International Day for the Victims of Terror. And yet there is not one Israeli victim of terror mentioned in that entire exhibition. There is no mention of the Palestinian terror. There is no mention of the October 7 massacre, the worst massacre against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. How is it that we're failing to get our message across? How is it that we're failing to persuade really the hearts and minds? So to join us and to try and unwrap some of those questions and possibly give some answers, I'm joined today by my friend, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricos, a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a former international spokesman for the IDF. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, my friend Maurice. A pleasure to be here with you.
I have to say, I've been trying for quite a long time to find the right opportunity to bring you on. And I think that this is it. Jonathan, tell us a little bit about, since we're talking about the idea of how messages come out from Israel to the wider international community, tell us a little bit about the workings of who sets that messaging. I have nothing but true admiration for someone who I consider to be fundamentally evil, for Hanan Ashrawi. Hanan Ashrawi, the spokesman for the PLO. It didn't matter what you asked Hanan Ashrawi. You could be talking about the weather in the Philippines. The weather in the Philippines is overcast and gray because of the Israeli occupation. It seemed like every single one of them had a set talking points and everyone stayed on point. And yet we don't seem to be able to get to that position. Why is that, Jonathan?
Yes, well, shalom, Maurice, and shalom to all of our viewers. I suppose near and far in the US, Europe, maybe a few in the Middle East and Asia. It's a complex question, and I think I can relate to the first part of your introduction and to speak about, the tactics versus strategy. Israel, and I agree with your assessment of the battlefield, I think Israel is defeating its enemies on the battlefield. And tactically, wherever there is an engagement, friction between Israeli forces and enemy forces, be they Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, Iranians, Syrians, or Palestinians, whomever they are, I think that across the board, what we're seeing are tactical Israeli victories against our enemies on the battlefield. And those are great, and those must continue. And we should give praise and credit to the security forces, Air Force, ground forces, Intel, Shabak, infantry, etc., Navy, all of them doing their jobs, and that's excellent. Where are we not delivering as a country and as a nation at war is at the strategic level. And when you speak about the war of perception or information warfare, we could also call it strategic communications. And I would like to connect between the strategic management of the war, the strategic leadership of the State of Israel, as opposed to the military and tactical and operational leadership, which exists headed by the IDF. The strategic level is, at least in my eyes, missing. And in terms of why, a simple question to your answer, why are we not getting our message out, or why do we perceive that we're not getting our message out, and why are our enemies enjoying such free and easy and convenient media environment, is because we're not even fighting. We're not fighting on a strategic level. We have no strategic infrastructure for strategic communications. There is no system and there is no national level coordination of substance that looks at this very important critical issue of strategic communications, which of course feeds into diplomacy, feeds into our everyday information warfare. It feeds into our public diplomacy, and it is so important. Yet Israel, which is blessed with so many talented, brave, and creative young men and women, and experienced young men and women, is falling short. And it's not only because the world hates us and there are so many anti-Semites and lazy and horrible journalists and editors. That is the fact, but that shouldn't really absolve us of the responsibility to be much better. So what we're seeing now is that Israel is fighting quite effectively on the battlefield, but in the realm of strategic planning and the strategic management of the war and the strategic communications, we're falling short because we're not really there. And I don't think that the State of Israel has said, under this government or the previous ones, or 15, 20 years back, I don't think that the strategic communications have gotten the resources, the personnel, the funding, and the priority that they should be getting in order to fulfill such an important task and effort for the State of Israel. And, I can give a positive example. Instead of only being negative, I'll give you a positive example of how the State of Israel, the young and surrounded by enemy State of Israel in the 1950s and 60s, before we expanded the country in the Golan Heights, Judea and Samaria and Sinai, before we created strategic depth, when there was a real tangible threat of extinction for the State of Israel. At that time, Israel defined the issue of water as a national priority. And the best and brightest minds in Israel, the engineers and the creators and the educators and legislators, all dealt with bringing or taking care of this very important natural resource, which was a national enabler, and that's water. And Israel went at it by infrastructure, by education, by research and development, by engineering, by ingenuity, and many other ways. And fast forward 40 years, 50 years from the early days of the State of Israel, today Israel is a regional superpower when it comes to water. We are the only country in the Middle East that are not suffering from any water insecurity. All other countries around us, even countries that are blessed with much more rainwater than Israel, like Turkey, have shortages of water. Israel doesn't, and we can trade in water because we have allocated resources and priority to dealing with the issue. Now, I take this as an example because I don't want only to be negative, but I want to give a positive example, because I'm a great believer in the ability of the State of Israel to achieve the unachievable, to do things that no other country has ever done, to revive a language that was dead and extinct for 2,000 years, to come back to a homeland that was void of its rightful owners for more than 2,000 years. And I think that we can overcome the strategic communications challenge that we have. But the absolute basic condition is that we first and foremost acknowledge that there is a void and a gap, and that there isn't a serious plan that is being executed, and then get busy working. And we have enough talented people, we have enough people who understand English and can speak in various languages and communicate well enough. And I agree with you that Hanan Ashrawi was a talented communicator. Sai Barikat was another one who, unfortunately, I give credit to being a good messenger of an adversary. And there are many others on the other side who got easy questions and softball questions and softball responses in the media, but nevertheless believed in their cause and communicated it quite well. We can and must do much, much better, but it's not only about the face in front of the camera. It's about having a system that prioritizes using intel generated by the IDF, Mossad, and Shabak for media purposes. It's to prioritize access to international media in order to show reality. It is to have an army of open source intel analysts working for Israel, young, talented, tech-savvy, media-savvy analysts that can quickly identify and disassemble fake news that our enemies are pumping out 20 times a day. And just like Israel has dominated and is very successful when it comes to defensive and offensive cyber, we can, if we allocate the resources, do much better when it comes to communications. But it's first and foremost a matter of deciding, allocating resources, and getting serious about it.
That's exactly what seems to be the problem. The startup nation has identified the communications arena as a central part of any of any battle, of any war that's going on, and yet it doesn't seem to have organized itself into, for example, in the army you have a central command, you have the divisions, and then you have the brigades, but we don't seem to have built that really that structure for communications, which is such an integral part of getting over our message and of allowing freedom, chofesh pa'ula, of assisting the army and the country to enjoy freedom of action, of movement, of not movement from physical movement from place to place, but really freedom of really operations.
Yeah.
That we can move forward, because that's part of it. When the press is constantly filled every single day with articles about Israel's evil nature, and there is no response. We're attacking hospitals and there's no response, and we're attacking schools and there's very little response. How do we find the way, Jonathan, to build that in a better way, to really apply the ingenuity of the startup nation to get to a better position? Is there a government ministry that deals with it? Is it the army that's meant to be dealing with it? Who's meant to be in charge? I can tell you, I did a study a while ago, just following certain integral parts to fighting anti-Semitism, fighting the BDS movement, and what I saw is that really those subjects had been moved like past the parcel at a kids' party, from one ministry to the next, serving political expedience, and all the time we're losing that battle. What haven't we understood? Where do we need to make that fundamental change? Is it army, civilian, government? Where is it?
Well, it begins with political leadership and decision. And I would say, in a careful and respectful way, that I think that the decisions made by consecutive Israeli governments, but except maybe one that stood out a little bit different, but for the last 20 years, what we have seen is our reckless politics that have eroded the capacity of the state of Israel to conduct and to manage its strategic communications well. On paper, there's the Public Diplomacy Directorate that exists as a result of the direct recommendation of the Vinograd Commission, which was appointed at the end of the Second Lebanon War, where it became apparent, and Israelis saw and felt and understood, that the battle for the hearts and minds, that the understanding that we need to, just as you say, generate legitimacy and freedom of operations in order to be able to pursue our strategic goals in war. Then it was against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we fell short on that, according to the Vinograd Commission in the Second Lebanon War, and it was therefore recommended that there should be one entity, one nation-level entity that had a task of coordinating the public diplomacy efforts of the State of Israel. All of the ministries, all of the parts of the government, including IDF and the entire defense establishment, police, Shabak, Mossad, but all of the different ministries as well. That exists on paper, and I do not mean to belittle anybody working there. I know some of the people who work there are talented and proud Zionists and patriots, and they work quite hard. But at the end of the day, they do not have authority and they do not have control. And just as you say very correctly, many of the inherent authorities and capabilities that once upon a time, and you would say logically, would be part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, have been sanctioned or have been auctioned off to different satellite ministries in order to suit political purposes of forming government. So you have fighting anti-Semitism in one ministry, and you have the diaspora in another one, and then you have outreach and diplomacy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But in general, what I would do is first and foremost concentrate everything under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Give the Ministry of Foreign Affairs the proper, adequate budget in order to hire and retain the best and brightest people in Israel. And you and I know that there are so many talented, bright, proud, patriot Israelis who would want to do more, but they need to be paid. They need to be compensated. And when you want quality personnel, you need to pay them quality salaries. And it starts with that. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not have that. Instead of opening new consulates and embassies around the world, Israel is closing. The Palestinians today have more consulates and embassies around the world than we have. And we are constantly restricting ourselves to lesser and lesser. There's no budget, no serious budget for digital campaigns, for the production of different videos, for digital content. We're still reliant on philanthropists and non-governmental sources to provide money and funding and talent in order to produce digital content. And it's not the job of the military. And I think that one of the reasons you asked about the IDF, one of the issues we have in Israel is that through, I would say, excellence and hard work, the IDF spokesperson unit has grown into almost a national presenter, and in some cases overshadowing the civilian parts of Israel, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the other ministries, in something that I believe it shouldn't be doing, because I don't think that it is the right image for Israel to be represented by men and women in uniform. And I say that as a man who most of his media appearances have been in uniform. But I think that the men and women in suits and skirts and civilian attire should be the ones representing Israel, and that we should be bringing the civilian parts of Israel forward. So I would, in short, consolidate and implement, first and foremost, the Vinograd Commission recommendations from 2006 and really implement them. Man and staff the Public Diplomacy Directorate. Have it full with excellent tech-savvy people who are capable of doing online battle, refuting and disabling fake news that are produced by the hour by our enemies, and doing that quickly in a relevant time. I would allocate intel resources like drones, airplanes, communications intel, etc. By default, 5% of IDF intel should be focused and directly streamlined to feed international media and to feed our strategic communications efforts. I would bolster the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and greatly strengthen it in terms of personnel, authority. I would consolidate the many issues that have been auctioned off to other ministries for political purposes and get them back to where they belong, to have them under one organizing ministry, which has unity of command, unity of control, and which can then do it in a much more efficient way. And most importantly, I would have the Prime Minister declare that this is a topic of the utmost importance. This is a national enabler. And if we don't treat it as a national enabler, then we shouldn't be surprised when it comes back to bite us and when our freedom of operation is restricted because we are not caring to it. Now, last thing I'll say, even when we will do this, and I'm still hopeful that we will, that the political incentive will be there and that the decisions will be made and that the structural changes will be taken into effect and all of the things that I recommended. Even when we'll do it, we'll still face an uphill battle. Just like you and your colleagues have written, and I've seen interesting work on your webpage, about the information warfare, how Hezbollah works, how Hamas works, how the Palestinian work, and how biased many times international media is against Israel. Even when we will up our game tenfold, we will still face an uphill battle, but at least then we'll know that we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, at least we're out there fighting and we're doing it well, just like the brave men and women who are now fighting on the various battlefronts, the real battlefronts. We need to be battling in the information domain as well. Currently, we're not doing it, and it is a shame and a loss, and it's something that couldn't be rectified a day too soon.
One of the particular restrictions that I've encountered, I try to do as thorough work as possible, but one of the continuous restrictions is the availability of information. That idea of intelligence information being so strictly guarded, even when there doesn't seem to be an obvious reason why it shouldn't be used openly, why it can't be used openly, pictures, videos, and really information about terrorists who have been killed and their backgrounds, and finding something really coherent that can provide a picture. And that seems to be one of the very stringent limitations. How does the army, how does the IDF spokesman, how would the public communications directorate get over that limitation of persuading the Shabak, persuading the IDF, persuading Amman to cooperate more and release more information, or as much information as possible that can get out? Because that certainly isn't or doesn't seem to be the case at the moment.
Yes, sadly, I agree with you. On one hand, it is the ability to generate intel and to analyze it and to produce it and deliver it in such a way that is relevant in time and in content to the media environment and that suits the strategic needs for Israel. I'll give a good example of an occasion where Israel actually did it and where it had significant effect, just to prove how important it is and just to show that there is a return on investment. Israel exposed that 12 Unra members, this was many months back, I think almost half a year ago, Israel exposed that 12 Unra members, active members of Unra, participated in the October 7 massacre inside Israel. Names and their affiliation to UNRWA, etc. Israel produced that based on solid intel work, both on the ground, documents that were seized, but also cross-referencing that with signals intelligence and also interrogations of Hamas terrorists that were apprehended in Gaza and in Israel. And then finally, Israel had this package. It went forward, briefed the American State Department and the Ministry and the Department of Defense, and then went to the UN and went public with it and did basically the first step of a campaign which had a tremendous effect on UNRWA. And it really brought to international attention how corrupt UNRWA is, how absolutely permeated UNRWA is with Hamas operatives, how totally in line and synchronized UNRWA is with Hamas activities, and how important UNRWA is for the survival of Hamas. And it even brought to a temporary halt the funding of UNRWA. And UNRWA really felt the heat. Now, Israel did that, and that was proper use of intel, declassified intel, and it had an effect. Sadly, Israel didn't continue. In warfare and in media, you have to, there's something called continuity of effort, right? You have to continue your effort. You have to keep firing at the enemy and keep pressure on the enemy. Otherwise, they'll have time to breathe and reorganize themselves and get away. Same thing in the media. If you relent and if you do not keep on pressure, then your enemy will get away. In this sense, Unra is an adversary. It is a supporter of Hamas and a Hamas enabler. And Israel, in my mind, should continue to collect intelligence, analyze it, and then to declassify it for the effect of undermining UNRWA and getting rid of UNRWA. But if I look back for the last 4 or 5 months, I haven't seen anything meaningful declassified by Israel. And I know that there's lots of intel there to be declassified. And I know that it's a very important strategic goal. And I wonder why it isn't going on. So I'd say this. There is, I think, a fundamental lack of understanding within the IDF Intel Directorate, within Shabak, and certain parts of Mossad, even though in my experience with Mossad, they are more media savvy and understand the importance of soft power better. But IDF and Shabak are very, very reluctant to expose Intel. And I can understand the need to protect sources, etc. But at the end of the day, there's tremendous waste of good intel that can be declassified and used for strategic communications, if only people are aware of what to look for. And coming back to the previous part of the question, if only there is a top-down demand from the national leadership and IDF leadership that there is intelligence that needs to be declassified for strategic communications purposes.
And when you talk about UNRWA, it really does bring me straight into the point that I wanted to address with you. And really, UNRWA is the focus. UNRWA is the focus of almost a dedicated website, governmental website that gives a lot of background information and that tells the story of what Israel has done around the world in order to persuade decision makers that UNRWA has been fundamentally infiltrated by Hamas and by the terrorists. But when I go onto the website, I would like to see a connection to a link to those letters, a link to that information. And yet all I find there is a link to a news article that talks about the same information. When you're looking to find a source to persuade people to go in one direction, you need primary sources. You can't rely on, as much as I have respect for the media and see it as an integral part of providing Israel's freedom of operations, media reports are not sufficient in order to sway hearts and minds. You need the raw material. And if that raw material has been sent around the world to decision makers around the world, I fail to really understand why it can't be made public and used by everybody. Why would I not be able to have that same access to all of that information? On occasion, we actually manage to get information that isn't publicly available, and really to go through that and present it on a first-hand basis. But that doesn't seem to be a push of the Israeli government. It's almost as if we've understood a bit of the problem, but we're not really dealing with the heart of the issue.
Yeah, we're not getting serious about helping ourselves. There's so many people. I get to travel a lot and go to various Jewish communities around the world, Europe, North America mostly. I've spoken with so many Friends of Israel organizations in Europe and in the US, and I think that they echo what you're saying, that they want to help, they want to amplify, they want to fight the information battle, and they want to gear up and fight on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people. And they know that Israel is the just side. They know that we are the ones defending ourselves against terrorism, and that we are the forces of light against the sea of darkness. And I do not mean that in a in a light manner. That is really what we are. We are fighting darkness all around us. We are fighting murderous monsters, and we are not doing ourselves any favors in getting support by our friends. And I think it is regrettable, but it is something that can be changed. And, you know, it's something that is a matter of directives, of leadership, of the ability to say this is an issue of national importance, and this should be the priority. And I want, for instance, I would say 5% of IDF and Shabak intel collection resources and analysis capacity are earmarked for, not for targeting and not for knowing where Muhammad is so we can put a bomb where he is, no, but in order to collect intelligence and to expose the wicked ways of our enemies and to expose what it is that we are fighting and to show it with examples, with evidence, with hard intel, which I agree with you is so much more compelling and so much more relatable than just a press statement or someone who is saying it. And there are many good examples of when it is done, it has an effect. When you bring good visuals, when you bring good intel, recordings, when you bring hard evidence, documents, etc., that prove your point, then it has effect. Even the most nasty and biased journalists, they find it difficult to disregard when Israel makes a coherent case. And again, the example of Unra is a good example of Israel that started to do something right, but then didn't follow through. And now Unra are more or less back to where they were before. They've been able to regain their donor base and they're getting funding. And there doesn't seem to be a real threat against Unra being expelled from the Gaza Strip. And I think that's a strategic defeat for Israel, because I believe that there won't be a day after in Gaza and there won't be stability or peace in Gaza while Unra is there and poisons the minds of young Gazans. It's simply not going to happen, just as there won't be stability and prosperity and peace for Israel as long as Hamas is there. And I question and ask myself, why is the state of Israel not making this a top priority to continue to undermine the legitimacy of our enemies, including adversaries and rogue actors like Unra? And why are we not helping ourselves more? And it is something that I think at the end of the day has to do with leadership, strategy, and political decision to do so.
But that really is the case with Unra. I recently had occasion to see very, very clear information, hard evidence that showed that Unra was really falsifying much of its reports, much of its activities, knowingly providing services to Hamas, albeit through straw men. And this is information that I haven't seen advertised or publicized anywhere else. It's information that we were privy to seeing, but under the condition that we not expose it and we not provide the details of what we'd seen, and really hampering our own efforts to provide the real story. And I was watching just recently an interview that you did with Eylon Levy, discussing an event at the beginning of the war where Israel invited Unra to participate in providing humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. And shockingly, I'd never seen this reported before, and it seemed to be something that you were exposing for the first time. Unra refused. What does that mean? A UN humanitarian organization refused to provide aid to the Gazans?
Exactly as you say it. Yes, this was, I'll remind everybody when this happened. This was in the early days after October the 7th, as Israel was beginning to comprehend the scale of the monstrosity of the October 7 attacks. And as Israel had mobilized reserves, more than 300,000, and was preparing to launch an attack on Hamas targets in Gaza. And what Israel wanted to do was to evacuate civilians out of northern Gaza in order to spare the lives of those civilians, in order to fight only against an armed enemy, the enemy combatants, the terrorists, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and those who are not enemy combatants. Israel, since we abide by international law, by our own democratic and Jewish values, we value life, and we don't want to kill innocent civilians. And as such, the safest place for civilians to be is not where the combat is. And if Israel can move the civilians out of the combat space, then that's a thing that Israel was willing to do, by the way, at a cost. Because, of course, when you advertise ahead of time to your enemy where you're going to operate, that provides the enemy with advantages and the ability to prepare and reinforce. So it comes at a significant military cost, but Israel, out of its respect for the sanctity of human life and international international law, did so. And I was, just amazed when I remember it. Avichai Adrei, the Arabic language spokesperson of the IDF, he issued a statement in Arabic where he warned Gazans, and this was the first notice that was given, that Gazans in northern Gaza City should evacuate Gaza City and move towards the south of the Gaza River. This was the first stage, and it took Israel 3 weeks to get about 900,000 or maybe a million out of 1.1 million Gazans who were in Gaza City, to get them out of the battlefield. It could have been much, much faster than that, and it could have been done in a much more organized and harmless way had Israel had the active participation and assistance of UN organizations and other NGOs present in Gaza. But Israel did not have that. They refused to cooperate. And when Israel went forward through the coordinator of the government activities in the territories, Major General Ghassan Elian, when he met with his counterparts, he and his lieutenants met with his counterparts, and Israel presented that this is what's going to happen. We're going to attack Hamas in Gaza. We want to save civilians. We need you, humanitarian organizations, to help us establish a humanitarian zone in southern Gaza, in the Muassi, where there is a humanitarian zone today. 10 months after, but we want to do that before the action starts so that it can be done in an orderly fashion to bring food and infrastructure and beds and tents and water and fuel and all the things that is part and parcel of humanitarian aid. And what Israel got in return was a no. Not only did they say no, but they went on a media offensive. And I, as a spokesperson in international media, was faced with what I felt was, I don't have proof of it, but it looked and smelled and quacked very much like a concerted effort, media effort against Israel, where someone was leading that effort, saying that Israel cannot call on the evacuation of civilians from their homes and that it would be tantamount to war crimes. And this was the phrase that kept reoccurring time and time again, and I had that thrown at me and my colleagues in the spokesperson office many times, that it would be tantamount to war crime to ask civilians to evacuate from the battlefield, to which we replied, based on the advice that we had been given from our Advocate General Department of International Law, of course it isn't. Utter nonsense. If you want to spare the lives of civilians, the best thing you can do is ask them to move from where the combat is going to be. It's the most humane and the most moral thing to do. And I was appalled by
international law.
Yeah, exactly. And I was appalled by the double negative. Not only were Unra, UNICEF, World Health Organization, and many other organizations, not only were they not helping in saving the lives of Palestinians in Gaza against what they knew was an imminent Israeli attack against Hamas, which was Hamas's attack against Israel, which was unprovoked, and Israel was retaliating and defending itself against Hamas. Not only did these humanitarian organizations, these allegedly humanitarian organizations, refuse to cooperate with Israel and to use their resources to evacuate hospitals, to evacuate people in need, children, elderly, disabled people, and Israel gave them enough time, but they refused to do so, left these Palestinians to their own fate. And these organizations cooperated with Hamas in making it more difficult for Palestinians to be evacuated out of Gaza City into southern part of Gaza, the Gaza Strip, the Muassi and Khan Yunis. And we see the consequences even today. And this behavior continues. And that's why I've been speaking about, and I've been speaking at different fora around the world as a senior fellow at FDD and other locations. I've been speaking about how UN institutions have failed their charter, have failed in their missions, have failed Palestinians. Of course, how they're failing Israelis, they continue to fail Israelis, but first the biggest culprit is Unra. But I have very little positive things to say about all of the other organizations who maybe some of their personnel came to Gaza in order to do good and to provide humanitarian assistance. But overall, generally speaking, what these organizations have been doing is facilitating the rule of Hamas and making it more difficult for Israel to defeat Hamas and free Gaza of Hamas. And I think that's an atrocity. And I think that if there was even the most basic level of decency and intro-perspective at these organizations, at UN headquarters and at Unra, UNICEF and other organizations and different national NGOs. The Norwegian Refugee Fund is one that constantly pops up as a main defender of Hamas in every forum. If these organizations really looked at their charter and asked themselves, what are we doing as opposed to what are we supposed to be doing? I think they would find that they are aiding and abetting a terrorist organization. They are extending suffering. They are making life more difficult for Palestinians who are trying to flee from battle, and they are failing in their mandates. And I think it is so sad. And it contributes, and with this I'll finish, it contributes to the erosion of global trust in these organizations. And, you know, I grew up in Sweden. I was born in Israel, but I grew up in Sweden. Unlike you, I don't know how much people believe in international organizations in South Africa. In Israel, in Sweden, they're the thing. It's like a second religion. People in Sweden, they're educated to believe that most of the problems can be solved by international organizations. And they're great believers in the UN. So I grew up in that environment, and I had this naive idea of, well, maybe they will do something good. But what I've seen in this war and what I've seen in many years of service in Israel, in hard reality on the ground, sadly is different, where these organizations are failing. And here I go back and towards Israel and what we should be doing. We, Israel, should have exposed that, and we should have done it in a concentrated way from day one. The minutes of that meeting, the recording of that meeting should have been made public by the Prime Minister, by the Chief of Staff, and it should have been front and center of Israeli messaging from that day until today. And it should have been said by Israel, we tried to evacuate people, we asked the UN for help, but at the end of the day, we were refused, and therefore responsibility rests on the shoulders of Hamas and also on the shoulders of these organizations. And Israel didn't do that. We should have done it, and I think it would have been better to explain our situation and for people around the world to understand the tremendous suffering in Gaza.
I think many people, many of our audience, I hope, will have seen a presentation that I gave in the JCPA just about a week ago, 10 days ago, exactly on that subject of Israel's relationship with the UN, and really it was a trek into just how entrenched the anti-Israel environment is in the UN. I opened with it as well, saying that they're marking International Day of Terrorism, but there's not a mention of an Israeli victim of the genocidal terrorism, and that's something which really is insidious. It's inbred into
even worse than that, Morris. I'll just interrupt you for a second. I saw Gilad Erdan's movie from the entrance to the exhibition. The exhibition, and he highlights that there's no Israeli victims displayed, but there is a Muslim woman. Yeah, and it says Palestine. And then when you look in the fine print, well, that was an unfortunate victim of a terrorist atrocity in New Zealand. not in so-called Palestine, wherever that is, but not in anything related to Israel, but it was
it's
a
just
woman
a little bit north of Narnia.
Yes, sadly. And it just, I served 3 years at UN headquarters on behalf of the State of Israel, on behalf of the IDF. I was seconded to the UN, and I spent 3 years there as an official Israeli working inside the UN, not part of the Israeli mission, but inside the UN, Department of Peacekeeping Operations. That was the name then, Office of Military Affairs. And I can attest to the fact that I met lots of good people. I met lots of people, mostly in the military, who have respect for Israel and who support Israel. But I also met tremendous institutional bias against Israel. So many people in positions of influence and power. I cannot explain their thinking and actions in any other way but to say that there is a darkness in their heart towards Israel, and they're using their power and authority in the UN in order to make life more difficult for Israelis. And it saddens me to say it, and I don't say it lightly, but that is what the bottom line of what I learned from 3 years of working at the UN within the UN establishment.
Jonathan, as we come to an end to the briefing, I always like to end with a positive note. Do you believe that Israel has the institutional environment, really the ability to identify the weakness and to then overcome that weakness through really creative thought? Or are we going to simply be stuck in the same situation where we are constantly winning on the ground but losing in the media? Is that something we can get over?
Definitely, yes. Israel has performed miracles, and there are so many great examples of the tremendous feats that the young state of Israel, the ancient nation, but the young state of Israel has performed in 76 years. And I really believe that we can, but it relies on leadership. It relies on courage and on brave decisions to be made, which may not be convenient from a political point of view, but are absolutely needed on a strategic level for the good of the state of Israel. And it's linked to other issues of the strategic management and the strategic planning in Israel. I think that is where we are at our weakest. That is where we do not excel, not in our strategic planning and not in how we complement the military activities on the ground and turn it into national level achievements. We do a lot of good through blood, sweat, and tears on the battlefield, through the tremendous sacrifice of the security forces, who again are worthy of tremendous respect and our thanks as civilians in Israel. I'm sure that many of the people watching are reservists as well, and I never waste an opportunity to thank the security forces, the commanders, the reservists, the regular troops for what they're doing. But what's missing in Israel, in my mind, is turning those achievements into strategic national level achievements, and our strategic communications is just one aspect of that weakness. Can we overcome it? Definitely we can. Can we improve our diplomatic relations with our most important ally and with the West? Definitely. Can we change the perception of Israel in the West and in many parts of the world? Yes, we can. We can do it through hard work, through allocating resources, through getting serious at it and really applying ourselves, our creative talent and our creative personnel. We can do it, but we just have to decide that this is a national priority. And once we decide, it will happen. Just like today, Israel flourishes from Dan to Eilat. There's overflowing, there's enough water everywhere. Exactly the same. Once upon a time, I'm sure that people couldn't imagine that we would be irrigating the desert with lots of water that we desalinate or recycle. Today, that's reality. So we can overcome it, but we just have to be serious about it and get busy fighting and doing it really well.
That's really, I believe, the most positive message that I've heard really going forward on this subject of the media. It is possible. We can make that change. And really, I think every single one of us has our position to play in making that change happen. And you are certainly leading that charge, really, both in the international fora and here in Israel, and even with us here, trying to really map out what the problem is as a first step, and for moving forward and for solving the problem. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us, and really for being the voice of Israel alongside Rear Admiral Hagari, of course, and Avichai Edrei, really speaking to many of us from the screens, and really giving a very calming report of what was going on, and an encouraging report of what was going on. So thank you for that. To our audience, we will be back with you again next week. In the meantime, please do stay safe. We'll be really delving into what the whole developing situation is with Lebanon. It's a subject, obviously, that we're spending a lot of time on, but it's a subject which is really developing all the time, and the trajectory at the moment seems to be quite destructive. But so on that note, have a good weekend, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Jonathan, thank you again.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you for having me.